Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. So today is the day after the American holiday Thanksgiving. The Canadians have their Thanksgiving back in October. My daughter, Sophia, is here for the weekend, and she's a new knitter. She learned when she was up here visiting over Labor Day in early September, and she's working on her first sweater. And she's knit quite a few accessories, and so I was really excited to take her to a few yarn shops today. Last night she said, "Oh, but I have to work," because she works remotely. And then I realized I have to work too. I have to do a Casual Friday podcast. So here we are. A couple of weeks ago, I posted in the community tab on YouTube a question. I said, it's knitting season, and what are your burning questions? And I got a lot of responses to that. So I'm going to go through, I can't answer all of them, but I'm going to answer as many of them as I can in the allotted time. So let's get started. I'm kind of going in reverse order just because that's the way I printed out the questions. So the most recent question I had, and two people were wondering about this. They wanted to know about this notebook that's right here that says FLAK on it. Now, it does not say FLAK as the word FLAK, F-L-A-C-K. It actually says FLAK, F-L-A-K. These are the initials of a knit-along that I did starting right at this time in 2005, so 19 years ago. It was when I first got back into knitting. I'd been on kind of a knitting hiatus for a few years. I wasn't knitting much. And when I did, I knit from existing patterns with existing stash yarn, like if I had to go to a baby shower or something. So I really hadn't knit for a few years. And I came back to knitting that March, and like, you know, the internet had discovered knitting. There were knitting blogs. I found Knitty, the online knitting magazine, which is still being published, and they had an article about the Master Hand Knitting Program, which thrilled me, the idea of that. So I started that. I started knitting socks, and so I joined all these Yahoo email groups. This is before Ravelry, so there were online knitting forums, but they were kind of scattered in different places. And that November, I heard on one of the Yahoo groups about this knit-along that was going to be starting called Follow the Leader Aran Knit-along, so F-L-A-K. And it was by Janet Szabo. She's also a master hand knitter, and she really loves cables, and she did a lot of Aran designs. What she had done was come up with the patterns, the stitch patterns for an Aran sweater that would be knit top down. Then you could pick your filler stitch, but you would do your swatching. You decide what style of sweater you wanted. Do you want a crew neck, a V-neck, a scoop neck? Do you want it to be a cardigan? You know, how big around? So you learned how to measure your body and figure out how you wanted things to fit. You picked the filler stitch that you wanted, but you didn't have to also come up with all the cable patterns. Some people did. Some people swapped out cable patterns. But it was a knit-along that she was producing a PDF every week for a while as we were measuring and swatching and getting started and doing different things. And then they started getting published further and further apart as people were knitting. And she was also writing a book called, I think it was called Aran, what is it? I'm sure it's out of print, but you might be able to find a used copy. It was not the same thing exactly as what the pattern was, but it was a companion thing. So it was a lot more in depth about going about designing your own Aran sweaters. And you can still get the PDF for the FLAK. It's still available for a price. At the time it was free because we were just doing it as it went along. Probably took close to 6 months to get all of the PDFs. And it took me a couple of years to knit that sweater because I've knit it during the winter, and then when there was no hope of finishing it for that season, I put it to the side and knit other things. So it took me a couple of years. It's the red Aran sweater that I wear a lot on this channel because it is one of my favorite sweaters. I've made various repairs and modifications to it over the years in Finish It February. I really love this. This was a great exercise in bridging between just strictly following somebody else's pattern and designing something yourself. So you just kind of got led through the process of what you needed to do. The tutorial that you have that you can get online does not include, you know, all the questions people had in the knit along, but it does have all of the material for what you need to do in order to knit. So I've always kept all of my PDFs in this notebook on that shelf. This next question is from Harriet Trivlin 5957. Should I make a few short rows at the back neck before the shoulder shaping on a cardigan? I'm thinking it would help the sweater sit right. A lot of sweaters these days are knit top down seamlessly, and they start with the neck by casting on all of the stitches for the neck and joining in the round. And because our neck, the base of our neck in the front is down here, but the base of our neck in the back is up higher, in order for a sweater to fit right when you have joined in the round from the beginning, you need to find a way to make the back of the sweater longer than the front. And so for sweaters like circular yokes, that's how you do that. That's how you prevent, you know, that the front of the neck from coming up, or bunching at the base of the front and the back coming up. It's often used for raglans, which are need a crew neck. They don't need to be knit that way. With a raglan, you could actually just knit back and forth and create an actual neck shape. And you'd have to do that if you were doing something like a V-neck. But for whatever reason, a lot of designers are choosing to cast on for the ribbing at the very beginning and joining in the round, and therefore short rows are needed to create that drop in the front and the rise in the back. This person, it sounded like they were knitting something bottom up, and they confirmed that in a follow-up. They were knitting a bottom up set-in sleeve sweater. When you are doing that, first of all, you're getting your neck shaping in, so you're creating the opening for the neck by knitting back and forth and working your decreases. So you're creating that neck shape. And then you are doing short rows or stair-step bind-offs, depending on what the pattern is, to create shoulders that are lower at the top of the armhole, and then they come up like this, so they're following the natural slope of your shoulder. So you've already got all of the shaping built into that. So you don't need to add additional short rows in the back of the sweater to make it sit right, unless you have another issue with fit, like some people might have just the way that their personal anatomy is, that the back of the sweater still wants to come up, and maybe it's because of hips or how what their back is shaped like. They might need more length for their back than other people might need, but that is not that's a separate fit issue, and it is not one that is needed in general. This question is from, I'm probably mispronouncing this, Lise Beckelers 3031. I'd like to know a nice SSK method or your preferred method to do an SSK decrease. Thank you for all your videos. I just do the standard SSK decrease, slip 2 stitches one at a time as if to knit, which changes their stitch mount. Insert the left needle through the front of those stitches so that both needles are through. The right hand needle, the working needle, is through the back of those stitches. Grab the working yarn and pull it through. That creates an untwisted left leaning decrease. Some people don't like the way this looks. And so they want to do an alternate form. So there are different alternate ways of doing it. The basic is slip one as if to knit, either then slip the next as if to purl, and then insert the left needle through, or you could return that first slip stitch back to the left needle and then knit through the back. There's different maneuvers that allow you to do everything in one move. Any of those, some people prefer the result of that. It does mean that the stitch that lies on the bottom is going to be twisted, but not very visible. It's not going to be visible to most people unless you're poking around. Because I did the Master Hand Knitting program, we were required to do the standard SSK. We were not allowed to work any sort of stitch that twisted something when it was not supposed to be twisted. So I just don't do those twisted versions. That doesn't mean that it's worse or you shouldn't do it. It's your knitting. Whatever gives you the result that you like is the decrease that you should work. Some people just knit through the 2 stitches through the back and it creates a totally twisted decrease, but they are fine with the twist because I just like the way that it looks in general. So it's just up to you and what it is you like. Tech Knitter, a link down below to her website. She has a method, I think it's called SYTK, slip, yank, twist, knit, to create a left leaning decrease that looks really nice. Again, there's a twist in it. I think the stitch that's ending up on the bottom has a full twist instead of a half twist. So it really takes any extra slack out of that top stitch and locks it in so that it can't move back. So it really just depends on what result you like. I personally tend to not like a result where there is a twisted stitch underneath because I think it, in my work, and in my eye, it lifts the top stitch above the surface of the fabric. And to me, that's visually disruptive. It just depends on what your sense of aesthetic is, the way that you execute things, how you're using it in your own project. There is no right and wrong here. You just need to know what your options are and figure out what is going to work best for you in your specific situation. And then you get to decide what works best, because knitting style will also affect your results. Some people will find that the more traditional slip one, knit one, pass slip stitch over, that's the one that they prefer. I don't see any difference in my own work between the slip one, knit one, pass slip stitch over and SSK. They look the same to me, but some people do notice a difference in their own work. So you just need to know what your different options are. I do have a video on 3 different ways of doing left leaning decreases. It does not include Tech Knitter's method, but I will leave a link to her method as well as to my video on the 3 different methods. And then you do a swatch, try them all out and see which one you prefer. This next question is from Nicole Wells, 9845. Can one mix superwash and non-superwash wool in the same project? For example, in colorways or scrappy sweater projects. So yes, you can always mix and match yarns, even ones that have different textures. I would suggest swatching first to see what you think of your superwash yarns mixed with the non-superwash. They're going to have different textures and they're going to have different behaviors in terms of the amount that they drape or hold themselves up. And some of that is going to depend on how the yarn was spun. The superwash is most likely going to be worsted spun, so very smooth, made even smoother from the superwash process, where the non-superwash might be worsted spun, so fairly smooth, but still have more, halo to it. And then woolen spun is going to be even fluffier. As long as you don't mind that difference in textures and drape in the yarns, you can do whatever you want. What I will say is that when you go to wash it, you have to keep in mind the yarn that is used that is most sensitive, like requires the most babying when being washed. So if the superwash wools can be machine washed in warm water and dried on low in the dryer, but you're using another yarn that is hand wash cold, lay flat to dry, you're going to have to hand wash cold, lay flat to dry because of that one yarn. Otherwise, if you throw it in the washer, that yarn that can't take machine washing is going to shrink up and felt and destroy everything. So yes, you can always mix things. You just have to keep in mind that they're going to drape differently and they're going to have different textures. And especially if you're using color work, they might behave differently in the color work. Now you might really like that effect. Superwash wools, because they're so smooth, you will get very defined stitches, like, you know, the color, each stitch will be very separate and noticeable from each other, where a woolen spun yarn is going to be fluffier and you get more of a painterly effect when you use woolen spun yarns. They kind of blend together. So if you're trying to do stranded color work and you're doing that, you need to keep that in mind, that some of those mixings are going to be tricky. This next question comes from Claire8776. I would like to know if brioche knit could be used in place of knit one, purl one ribbing. And I will say it can be. You need to consider whether this is something that's like a vertical button band, that might be knit separately and then sewn on to the garment so that you have control of how long you're making that, or if it's something that's horizontal. They're going to have different gauges. So if you knit a hat and it's calling for 100 stitches and do knit one, purl one ribbing and then switch to whatever the pattern is for the body of the hat, and you want to use brioche instead because it's cushier, might be warmer, that's fine, but you need to take into account the gauge of that brioche. You need to swatch it out and see what the gauge is, and you might need a different stitch count for the ribbing than you would need for the body of the hat, potentially. And so then you would need to adjust the stitch count when you were transitioning from the brioche to whatever the stitch pattern is. So I did do a sweater a couple of years ago. I reverse engineered a commercially knit sweater, and I was really interested in how it's constructed, and I tried to replicate a lot of the interesting details about it, and one of them was that the front button bands was in brioche. But the other ribbing, the horizontal bands, were not. Those were like a knit two, purl two ribbing. I imagine if they thought brioche was a good idea for the horizontal ribbings, they would have used that, and they didn't. But that doesn't mean you couldn't. It just means I haven't done it, and I haven't worked through the potential issues. And the way to figure that out is swatching. The answer is almost always try it out on a swatch and see what you think. This next question comes from Jan and Steve Dubois, 7356. I would love you to demonstrate a jogless join for color change in the round on knit two, purl two ribbing. First stitch in the round is the knit, last stitch is the purl. First of all, if you are doing color changes in ribbing, typically a really nice result to avoid the little blips of color that you get in purls when you are changing from one color to another. In ribbing, if you're doing color changes, the first thing you do is work around in just stockinette in the new color. And then you avoid the blips. And then you can switch to your ribbing. Now, they're also talking about avoiding the jog in the color. So my feeling is if you're doing, and I haven't tried this, you're gonna have to swatch. If you do that round in the stockinette, then you can use the regular jogless color change technique, and then you can switch to ribbing. I've got a video on 2 different methods for jogless color changes for stripes in the round. And so you could try those. So first thing you do is that stockinette in the round, use your color change technique, and then switch to working your ribbing. I will leave links to both of those two videos, the one about avoiding color blips and the one about the two methods of doing stripes in the round without a jog. This question is from Mendy Viola, or Viola. How to join in slippery yarns like bamboo. In many respects, this is no different from joining other kinds of yarns that are not feltable. So typically what I do is with the new yarn, I create a slip knot, put the old tail through that so I can slide the slip knot up. This just provides some tension in the new ball of yarn so that you can start knitting and not have a big gap. Later on, you come back to that when it's time to weave in ends. You take that slip knot out so those two tails are just hanging, and then you cross them on the back and weave them in using reverse duplicate stitch. So I have a video on how to weave in ends with reverse duplicate stitch down below. Sometimes, and the thing with the slippery yarns is you need a long enough tail. The reverse duplicate stitch is really nice because it follows the path of an existing row of stitches. So when the fabric stretches, that tail stretches with it. So if you usually are weaving in on a diagonal and the fabric stretches, things might come undone a little bit. But assuming you have a long enough tail and you weave in for 7 stitches or maybe more if it's really slippery and you're worried, weaving it in along the same row, following the path of the existing row of stitches, is going to work really well. Now, if you've got a color change and you're trying to weave in on the back of a different color, usually it will not show through, but if you're worried about a really light and dark contrast, then when you're weaving in the ends, those two tails hanging down, you want to link them together like this so that they're each doing a U-turn around each other, and then you can weave them in their color so that it won't show through. There are other ways of joining in tails as you knit so you don't have to weave them in later. This is just my preferred method, but really the key is a long enough tail and not keeping it too short. I did help a friend years ago, and this has only happened one time in almost 40 years of my knitting where I was in this situation. This was like a novelty yarn that was really popular about maybe 15 or so years ago, where it was different slippery novelty yarns of the same color, and then they were kind of tied together. So you'd get a certain length of something that would be like eyelash yarn, and then you'd get a length of something that would be some other kind of highly textured novelty yarn. And that was so slippery that we were really struggling to weave the ends in on that. And also because it was not just like a cylindrical yarn, it was like highly textured. So we did the best we could, and then she took sewing thread and tacked it down because it was sort of like ribbons in a way that we were working with. And in that case, that was the only time that I would ever suggest using something like thread, sewing thread to tack it down. But that's because the yarn was extremely unusual. But bamboo shouldn't really be a problem, I wouldn't think. This question comes from Kath Everett, who I think I met at a retreat many, many years ago. What is your favorite way to alternate skeins? So alternating skeins is something that you would need to do if you're working with a yarn like, I've got one here. So this is like a tonal or semi-solid yarn. This is a Malabrigo Rios. And I was trying to knit a sweater with this years ago, and I really thought these were close enough in color. I knit the first half of the back of the sweater with one skein, and then I switched to the other, and then I could see that color change line. And so the way that you avoid that with hand-painted yarns, Malabrigo I think is kettle dyed, but it has the same issue, is that you need to alternate between two skeins. So if you are working flat back and forth, you would alternate like every 2 rows. And if you were working in the round, you could alternate every round or every other round or whatever. So you work 2 rounds with 1 or 2 rounds with one color, and then you link them together. You're joining them up the side and switch to the other one. And this mixes the yarns together consistently. Now, and then you have to worry about what happens if they both run out at the same time, and then you need to start a third one. So you can plan for that ahead of time by doing something like starting out with half a skein of one color and a full skein of the other. And so one of them is going to run out before the other. And so that you're staggering the when you are joining one into another. But you can probably figure that out based on how much yarn you might need for the back versus the front versus the sleeve, that kind of thing. So I don't do this a lot because it is frustrating. And the sweater that I started, I ended up ripping it out a couple of years ago because it had sat there for so long. I was kind of discouraged by it. But I do have plans for it in the near future. And so I have been thinking about this. What am I going to do about alternating? And it will probably be the every other round and starting with a half a skein of one and a full skein of the other, and just kind of working with things that way. This question is also from Kath Everett. Here's a basic one. Increase every 3 rows. Do you increase in the 3rd row or the 4th row? I'm really hoping it's the 3rd. So every 3 rows is the same thing as every 3rd row. So if you were supposed to do an increase every 3rd row, then you would do it on the 3rd row, on the 6th row, on the 9th row, on the 12th row, like that. Sometimes your pattern might say increase on the next row and then every 3rd row after that. So then it would be row 1, row 4, row 7, row 10, because you'd be starting with 1 instead of 3. But that's the rule. Now, if you're increasing every 3rd row and you're actually working flat, then you are going to be alternating between increasing on a right side row and a wrong side row. If it's actually increasing every 3rd round, that's a little easier because the right side is always going to be facing you. Typically, when you are working flat, the pattern will be set up so that you are always increasing or decreasing on right side rows. And so you will see sometimes that you will have to increase every 6th row for a while and then maybe every 8th row. And that's because trying to increase every 7th row would be a hassle. And so they just give you 2 different increase rates in order to avoid that kind of a situation. But when you're working in the round, you don't have to worry about that. You can always increase on any row, whether it's an even number of rows or an odd number. This question is from Katie AE6160. How to convert a written pattern to a chart? I always get lost in written patterns, so I always chart them out before I begin. But boy, sometimes they are not written with that in mind. I recently charted a pattern for a raglan sweater that had no round numbers. They were all just next round, next round. And she said she was able to chart it out, but it did not look at all like a sweater. Here's the challenge when you are charting out something that's in the round where you have a lot of increases, is that you have to make allowances, first of all, for the space that increases will fill. And so you really need to almost chart out each piece separately, the back, the sleeve, and the front, in order to make that work so that you can see how each piece on either side of the seam line is going to be shaped. And I actually have a vintage knitting book that shows how to chart out something like that. So one second. I have this book right here. It's this Minerva knitting manual. It was published in the 1930s. And they are actually using grids to design their patterns. Like their patterns for sweaters, first they're in one size, so that makes it easy. But they have like a paragraph of instruction, but most of the information is on a gridded chart. And one of the things that they show in here is how to chart out a raglan sweater. And they show it in a couple of ways. They have one, I'll go to the overhead and then you can see what this is. And then maybe this will give you an idea for how you can do this in your charting software, which is going to be a little bit different. So this is how they're suggesting that you chart out a raglan that is knit in pieces and then seamed together. And they're using a 1-inch grid so that you're doing this by measurement. It sounds like you might actually be doing something with the stitch pattern, but I don't know for sure. It might just be that you're trying to visualize what the pieces look like. They also have instructions for how to chart a knit-in raglan. So this is one, again, this is the 1930s, top-down raglan on a circular needle. So they're charting out each separate piece. So if you are using charting software or a spreadsheet or something, don't try to do the entire round on something that is flat. Instead, like this right here, they're identifying the seam stitch. So you do the different shapes knowing that there's a seam stitch in between them. So you're going to chart each of these out on their own, each of these out on their own. But this is essentially what you have to do. And you're going to be, if you're working top down, you're going to start in the center. You're going to have it wide enough to handle all of the stitches. And you're going to have a lot of blank area that you're filling in as you gradually get wider. But that's why it's not going to look like a sweater. If you're doing all of these rows, like from the beginning of the round to the end, all the way across, you're not taking into account the space that the increase is going to be filling in over time from the top of the neck down. So this is what I would suggest for something like that, is to map out each piece separately. This next question is from Catherine Jelly 4437. Now that winter is on its way in the north, which is the warmest yarn? Is it Lopi, alpaca, another? Which stitch pattern is warmest? But they were asking stocking stitch, ribbing, stranded color work, that kind of thing. So as far as I know, the warmest fiber is Kiviot. It's extremely expensive. There's no reason that you have to have the warmest yarn in order to make something warm enough for living in the north. This sweater I'm wearing right here is a bulky yarn, but it is woolen spun. It has twice the yardage that you would expect in a worsted spun yarn, so there's half as much fiber per 100 grams, and yet it's extremely warm because it's woolen spun. The fibers are more disorganized, and so they trap more air in there. So a woolen spun yarn tends to be warmer than a worsted spun yarn. So that's one way to get more warmth. Another is if you are packing more stitches in per square inch with the same yarn, it's going to be warmer. For example, stocking stitch is or stockinette is very flat. So a single layer of stockinette is probably going to be the least warm. And then if you have something like ribbing that has the same number of stitches that's going to conform to your body, it's pulling in when it's relaxed. And so that is going to create that same fabric but in a smaller amount of space. And so that's going to be warmer. If you do something that's heavily cabled, that will take a lot more yarn. And because it has got more yarn in it, it's going to weigh more, but it's going to be warmer as well. Stranded color work is going to be warmer than a single layer of stockinette because you're going to have 2 layers of yarn in there. And so that's going to be warmer as well. So there are a lot of ways to add warmth. But if you used a woolen spun yarn and you did stranded color work, you'd have something that was very warm. Even if it was fingering weight, you're going to have all of that extra warmth because of the way that the yarn is constructed, as well as the way that the knitting fabric is constructed as well. This next question comes from Charlie McKee 1722. All the patterns I'm knitting keep on suggesting an Italian bind off, but there's no knit purl ribbing, knit 1 purl 1, knit 1 purl 1, or knit 2 purl 2, knit 2 purl 2. Instead, there are different knit purl patterns in the row before the bind off. How should I do an Italian bind off for a stitch pattern that is not knit purl ribbing? If it's seed stitch, you could still do it, and you would do the bind off as for the purls like you would normally do for a knit, and for a knit as if for a purl, and then that will keep the stitch pattern continuity. If it's for some other kind of stitch pattern, I don't know how they justify doing that one. It isn't that you can't do it, but you have to ignore that whether you're working with a knit or purl. You just have to do the steps, you know, bind off is for a knit, bind off is for a purl, like as if you were doing knit 1 purl 1 ribbing and ignoring the stitch pattern. I don't think that's particularly attractive. I personally would choose a different type of bind off, and so that you could either a different sewn bind off, like the sewn bind off, or half hitch bind off, which looks like a long tail cast on, the smooth side of a long tail cast on. You could do that if you wanted the sewn bind off. Otherwise, just do any kind of bind off that you would normally do in pattern, so that you can maintain your stitch pattern while you're working. So I don't see a reason why, like, you don't have to do what the pattern says, especially if you think, I mean, you could try it on a swatch, do a little bit of the knit purl pattern on a swatch, and then see what it looks like, and see if you can keep track of whether you're binding off in knit or purl, you know, even though the stitches that are on the needle are not correct for that. See if you can keep track of that, and if you like the result, and if you don't, use something else. That's what I would do. This question comes from the Plaid Sheep Oracle. What is your favorite depilling method? Does it vary by type of yarn? The method I typically use is just to pick the pills off. The yarns I tend to use most are like a standard worsted weight, worsted spun yarn, and doesn't get a lot of pilling, and so picking off is typically, if it's something that's fuzzier, or like this is a woolen spun yarn, it's probably going to get pills because of that. I might try using something else. I have various tools that I hardly ever use, like a gleamer, just different things that can help scrape things off. They all work to some extent. But if you can if it's just like in the underarms or in certain places like that, I just pick them off. Just spend 10 or 15 minutes picking them off, and that seems to work pretty well for me. Dana Dunham 1660 asks, comments about mosaic knitting, which seems to be the rage. Mosaic knitting is a subset of slip stitch patterns, and specifically slip stitch color patterns. So back in like probably 1970 or so, Barbara Walker published her second Treasury of knitting patterns. It's a stitch dictionary, and she includes in here a chapter on mosaic knitting. As far as I know, she kind of developed this. So she introduces it in this book, and then she writes an entire book on mosaic knitting here, where she explains how it works, how to chart it out, and then it's essentially a huge stitch dictionary of different patterns. So she's got, she does them in black and white so that you can see the contrast, but she shows how they're charted out. And the way she did it was garter stitch. I know she mentions in here something about doing it in stockinette versus garter stitch, and how you can do that, but it changes the proportions of the stitch pattern. But the way that she created it 50 years ago, 55 years ago, was as garter stitch, because it's very geometric. And what's nice about it is that you're working with two colors, but you're only working with one color in a given row. So here's an example of a slip stitch pattern that is not mosaic, and this is 2-color. And what you can see is sometimes, I don't know if it's just the blue, yeah, sometimes the blue color is slipped on the right side of the work, so you get this horizontal bar of color. This is not mosaic knitting. And also this is in stockinette. It's really nice, but it isn't mosaic. So this is mosaic. This is a pattern from her book. I don't know if it's from the second Treasury. I'll put information about the second Treasury as well as mosaic knitting, and I will cite which book these 2 swatches are from if you're interested. But mosaic knitting, as she was describing it, was done in garter stitch, and you always slip the color that's not being worked on the wrong side of the work. So you never see those horizontal bands on the front of the work. And she liked it in garter stitch because it was very geometric. When you do these mosaic patterns in stockinette, which you can do, it just changes the way that the geometry looks, because stockinette stitches are wider than they are tall, and where garter stitch, you have 1 stitch is same width as 2 rows, so you get this very geometric looking thing. So over the 50-some years since she introduced this idea, people have used it in different ways, including knitting in the round. If you're knitting in the round, then you don't have to do the same thing 2 rows in a row. So if you're knitting flat, you have the color you're working with, you go across and back, and then you can switch to the other color that's hanging on that edge, work across and back. If you're working in the round, you have both yarns hanging from the beginning of the round. You work in the round, you don't have to do it a second time, technically, because the other yarn is available. So some people will do that as well. So it's evolved, you know, and in some ways it's evolved quite a ways away from what she originally did, because I don't really see this kind of mosaic knitting done very often. I think mostly it's a way of doing 2-color knitting without having to bother with alternating yarns as you're going. You can just use 1 yarn at a time. Valerie Conrad 1005 asks, I'd like to hear more about superwash wool versus regular wool when it comes to sweater making. What are the differences, similarities, and why would you choose one over the other? My default is to use non-superwash wool. That's just my preference, but I do use superwash wool. So I always take into account the type of project it is and who the recipient is. So if I'm making something for a child like my grandniece or my grandnephew, they're little kids, I'm going to make it out of a superwash wool or a superwash acrylic blend, because it's going to need to be machine washed. If the recipient is somebody who isn't going to hand wash something, no matter how easy hand washing is, then superwash would be another reason. I'm also looking at the structure of whatever I'm making, like whether it's an accessory or a garment. If the garment has some sort of structure built into it, like there are seams at the shoulders, there are bind-off edges for keeping the back of the neck from stretching, and then stitches are picked up for the neck. You know, things that are holding that sweater up at the shoulders and able to handle the weight. If it has that, then I'm more likely to use a superwash wool. Or if it's fingering weight, that just isn't as heavy, and I might go with a superwash wool as well. If it's something like a circular yoke sweater that has stranded color work, the stranded color work is going to have some structure because it's going to prevent the fabric from stretching as much as just plain stockinette in a single color would have. So if I was knitting a circular yoke sweater or a seamless raglan sweater in a single color, I might not use superwash for that because it just isn't anything that's holding that sweater up, you know, at the shoulders and preventing it from the neck from stretching wide and sliding down. If I was using a non-superwash wool, the scales of that wool are going to help hold things together, and a woolen spun yarn is really, it's going to hold itself up. So, and it's going to tend to be lighter in weight for the amount of yardage you have as well. It all comes down to what is the construction method of the garment or accessory, and does the yarn have any structure built into it? If the yarn has no structure built into it, then the garment needs some structure. If the garment has structure, then you can worry less about that. The other thing is, you know, how loose is the gauge relative to what is recommended? If you're working at a looser gauge, that's going to, you know, reduce the amount of internal structure in the yarn as well. Another thing to think about is the kind of stitch pattern that you are using. If you are using, if you're going to be doing stranded color work and you want stitch definition where you see every single stitch on its own and separately as color, superwash could be really good for that. If you like that look of stitches sort of more blending together, then a woolen spun yarn, which is not going to be superwash, a woolen spun yarn is going to give you that effect. So yeah, it just, there are a lot of things to think about, but yarn structure versus garment structure are the things that I'm going to be looking at, is what is doing that sort of heavy lifting or support of shoulders if you're talking about something like a sweater. Sarah Brooklyn Studio 7187 asks, where do I start with color work and Fair Isle? So let's define some terms here. Color work just means using more than one color in the project. That could be stripes. That could be a slip stitch pattern like the ones we talked about earlier, which include mosaic. It could be stranded color work. It could be Fair Isle, which is a subset of stranded color work. Not all stranded color work is Fair Isle. It could be intarsia, which is color block knitting, which is a single layer of stockinette. You're not carrying yarns across the back. When you're switching from one color to the other, you're linking them together and you have separate balls of yarn for each block of color. So you might have 30 color changes in the back of a sweater because you've got an intricate design and you've got 30 tiny little balls of yarn hanging from there. So there are a lot of different types of color work. So stripes is going to be the easiest because you're only working with one color at a time. But if you're wanting to start with stranded color work, which again, Fair Isle is a subset of, I probably would recommend Fair Isle patterns or stranded color work patterns that kind of follow the same rules that Fair Isle follows, meaning that there is a limited number of stitches that are worked before you are switching from back and forth. So maybe you have no more than 5 or 6 stitches in a color before you switch to the other color. So you have very short floats on the back of the work. Those can be easy. Starting with things that are 2 or 3 stitches, alternating can be good. You need to find a way to handle working with 2 colors at the same time. There are many, many ways of doing that. I have a series of videos on stranded color work that talk about the different ways that you can handle the yarn, the different ways that you can switch between yarns for different effects, whether you have a dominant color, this color dominance or not. But I would just pick something. I would pick something like a hat or something that was a cowl. It's a good thing too, something that's large enough in circumference that it's fairly easy to do the rounds. Very small circumferences like mittens or socks can be more challenging to deal with the strands, unless you're one strategy is to turn that tube inside out so that you're working those floats are floating around on the outside of the tube, and that helps to prevent them from being too short. But I would start with something like a cowl and something that has pretty simple changes, only 2 colors in a row. Don't do anything that's got 3 colors or more in a that you have to manage, if that's what you're looking for, is stranded color work. But again, there's tons of different ways of doing color work, and many of them are not stranded or virile. The last question is from Jonine Twistle 7653. She asks, what questions do you have for someone dealing with carpal tunnel syndrome who enjoys knitting? I have a couple of suggestions. One is try another knitting style. See if you can, if you are a continental knitter, see if you can try one of the many different ways of knitting with the yarn in your right hand. Doesn't mean you have to change completely. It just means that if you have another way of doing things, and you might not get the same gauge on the same needles with your 2 different styles. So keep one project with English style, one project with continental. And if you find that you are having problem with your main method, switch to the other project. Take frequent breaks. Maybe work with a physical therapist to see what kinds of exercises you could do for your hands and your arms to make sure that you're not hurting yourself. Also, this book right here, Knitting Comfortably by Carson Demers. He's a physical therapist and a knitter. So he has a lot of information about keeping your body healthy while you're knitting. So there might be some good tips in there. But those are the things that I would recommend, is try other knitting styles, talk to a physical therapist about things that you can do and exercises that you can do, and maybe consult this book. I'll leave a link to his website. He sells these himself from his website, so I'll leave a link to that in case you are interested. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.